Calvin Howard was broken by grief, having lost his wife and his faith in life. His world was destroyed not only by the loss, but also by evil people who tried to take away the last thing he had left his family. But fate sent him an unexpected ally in the form of a brave girl, and this alliance changed his life forever. What happened next, and how did this once grief-stricken man manage to defy those who wanted to destroy him? Watch the story to the end to find out how shocking the climax turned out to be and why true strength is not the power of weapons, but the power of the spirit. And at the end, a powerful conclusion awaits you that will help you understand the full depth of this story. Don't miss it. Calvin Howard couldn't remember the last time he had looked at his reflection in the mirror without that frozen emptiness in his eyes. It had appeared for months ago and had taken up permanent residence there, displacing everything else: laughter, hope, even pain. The pain was too great to fit inside one person, and it had simply shattered into pieces, leaving behind only a cold chill. It was 1880, and their ranch in Montana was all he had. He had built it with his own hands, the logs hewn with his axe, and every crack filled with clay mixed with sweat and love. It was a home that smelled of fresh baking and hay, where the walls remembered children's games and the lullabies his Lily used to sing. But now the ranch was different. It was alive, but it lived a life of its own, separate from Calvin. The children, Andrew, 7, with eyes the color of a July sky, and his 4-year-old twins, Michael and Thomas, who looked like teepees in a pod, and tiny 3-year-old Emma with pigtails that Lily had braided for her every morning they were alive. Their laughter, their tears, their little palms that reached for him, all of it was there. But Calvin himself was like a shadow, a ghost in his own home. Compassion, that's what the neighbors felt when they saw him. They brought food, tried to talk, but he didn't hear. He just nodded in response and looked away. He saw pity in their eyes, and it was worse than any pain. The days flowed like water in a river, bringing with them only monotony. Waking up with the first rays of the sun, tending to the livestock, the fields, dinner which he prepared in a hurry, and then the children again. He had no time for himself, for his feelings. His whole world had shrunk to these four small lives. He tried. He really tried. He coped. He did the laundry. He mended their clothes. But nothing turned out right. The food was bland, the clothes were coarse, and a dead silence filled the house, one that even the children's clamor couldn't drown out. He was like an unskilled apprentice trying to replicate a master's masterpiece, but failing because his hands lacked the soul that Lily's had. One evening, as he was putting Andrew to bed, the boy hugged him tightly. "Dad, you're sad," he said, his voice small and trembling. "I'm not sad, son," Calvin lied, stroking his head. "You are very sad," Andrew insisted. "You don't sing to us like Mommy." Calvin didn't know what to say. He tried to hum an old lullaby, but the words got stuck in his throat. He could never remember how Lily had started to sing, and it broke his heart. Every day, it seemed, was a new reminder of what he had lost. Calvin tried to keep the ranch running, but without Lily, it was almost impossible. He had to split his time between working in the field and taking care of the children. It was especially hard in the winter. He chopped firewood, shoveled snow, fed the livestock, and the children were left alone in the house. One day, Michael, playing with fire, almost set the house ablaze. Calvin managed to put out the fire, but this incident became another blow for him. He felt that he was losing control, that his children were growing up in chaos, that he couldn't give them what Lily should have. With each passing day, his despair grew. He felt like a failure, a man who couldn't protect his wife and now couldn't even take care of his children. He looked at Lily's portrait hanging on the wall, and tears, too bitter to fall, stood in his eyes. One cold, gray morning, he saw a wagon on the road. It was old and battered, and Calvin thought it must be a tramp looking for a place to stay the night. But the wagon stopped at their house, and a woman got out. She was short, with dark hair tied in a bun, and a stern face. In her hand she held a loaf of bread, plain, still warm, homemade bread. Calvin walked over to her, not knowing what to say. He wasn't ready for guests. The children, seeing the woman, curiously peered out the window, and Emma even waved to her. The woman smiled at her, and that smile was so genuine and warm that for a moment, Calvin forgot about his emptiness. "My name is Sarah," she said, holding out the bread to him. "I heard about you in town. I thought you might be happy to have some fresh baking." Calvin took the loaf, and his heart tightened for a moment with a strange but pleasant pain. He couldn't remember the last time he had held something so simple and warm in his hands. He didn't even immediately realize that he needed to respond. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. I'm Calvin." Sarah nodded, and then her gaze fell on the children. She walked up to the porch where they were standing and knelt down to be on their level. "You have beautiful children, Calvin," she said. And there was no pity in her voice, only sincerity. Calvin felt something inside him stir. He wasn't used to this kind of treatment. People usually looked at him with sympathy, as if he were a miserable widower. But this woman, she looked at him as a man, and at his children as little people who needed care and love. As she was leaving, he couldn't help but ask, "Why did you do that, Sarah?" She turned around and smiled. "I just brought you some bread, Calvin. That's all." And she left. Calvin stood still, holding the warm loaf in his hands. His heart tightened with a new, heretofore unknown emotion. It wasn't pity, not pain, nor despair. It was sadness, but a sadness that had something bright in it. He realized that even in his broken life, there was a place for something simple and good. He went inside and cut the bread. The children fell upon it with greed. They hadn't eaten anything like it in a long time. Calvin also took a bite. The taste was simple, but it was the most delicious bread he had ever eaten. Because it wasn't made of flour and water. It was made of compassion and kindness. And in that moment, Calvin knew what he had to do. He couldn't continue to live like a ghost. He had to fight. He had to learn to be for his children not only a father, but a mother, a friend, and everything that Lily had been for them. And that was his decision. Not to win, not to overcome the pain, but simply to start living, for their sake. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, a small, barely noticeable, but bright spark of revival appeared in his empty eyes. He knew it would be a long and difficult road, but he was no longer alone. He had his children, and he had this loaf of bread, which had become a symbol of hope for him. After Sarah left, the Howard Ranch was filled with a new, unfamiliar, but welcome scent, the aroma of freshly baked bread. Calvin, still holding the warm, crusty piece in his hands, felt something stir in his heart, which had been walled up in for months of grief. Not pain, not sadness, but a tiny, almost imperceptible sprout of hope. He looked at his children, who were greedily devouring the bread, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. It wasn't the happy, broad smile that the walls of this house remembered, but rather a shadow, a promise of a smile. But it was enough. Calvin's resolve, which had appeared after his meeting with Sarah, was as fragile as the first ice on the river, but he held on to it with all his might. He realized that his children needed him, and he couldn't allow himself to drown in his sorrow. Calvin began to look at his life and his ranch in a new way. He no longer simply performed routine work, he was fighting for his family's future. He began to prepare dinner more carefully, remembering how Lily had done it. He tried to sing lullabies to the children, even if he was off-key, but they listened, and that was the most important thing for him. One morning, as he was fixing the fence from which the chickens constantly escaped, he saw that the same wagon was again approaching the house. Sarah got out of it. She was holding a basket in her hands. Calvin felt awkward. He was used to being helped, but not to being shown such attention. "Hello, Calvin," Sarah said. "I've been thinking. You probably need some help." Calvin wanted to refuse. A man in the Wild West was supposed to be self-sufficient. Accepting help from a woman was unfamiliar to him. But he looked at the fence, at the leaky roof, at the pile of unwashed laundry, and realized that he couldn't. "I don't know, Sarah," he began. "You don't need to know anything," she interrupted him, smiling. "Just accept my help. I can help with the house and the children while you work. I'm an orphan, and I have nowhere to go. But I know how to cook and sew. My mother taught me everything she knew." This was unexpected. She offered him not just help, but a part of her life. Calvin didn't know what to say. But then Emma ran up to Sarah. She hugged her legs, looking up at her with her big blue eyes. "Will you come back?" Emma asked. There was such a plea in the girl's voice that Calvin couldn't help but give in. He knew that he was doing it not for himself, but for them. "Okay," he said to Sarah, "but I can't pay you." "I don't need money, Calvin," she replied. "I just need a place where I can be useful." So Sarah settled on their ranch. Her arrival was not just help for Calvin, but a revival. With her arrival, new sounds and smells appeared in the house. The smell of freshly baked pies, which she baked every day. The sound of her voice when she sang lullabies to the children. Calvin felt his world, once destroyed, slowly begin to rebuild. He saw how the children were becoming happy again, how they laughed and played. He saw how Andrew was starting to believe again that his father was strong. Sarah was not like Lily. Lily was gentle and soft, like a summer rain, while Sarah was strong and firm, like an autumn wind. She didn't baby the children, but taught them to be disciplined. She taught Andrew how to milk a cow, and the twins how to chop firewood. She talked to them not like they were little kids, but like future men, and they liked it. She explained to them how important it was to be hardworking and responsible. The children listened to her because she wasn't trying to replace their mother. She was just Sarah. Calvin watched her from a distance, feeling his heart begin to beat again. But he was cautious. He was afraid of losing someone he cared about again. He kept Sarah at a distance, not allowing her to get too close. He was grateful to her, but at the same time, he felt a strange feeling for her. It was something more than gratitude, but he was afraid to name that feeling. One night, when the children were already asleep, he heard Sarah quietly crying in her room. Calvin didn't know what to do. He wanted to go to her, but he was afraid. He was afraid of invading her personal space, afraid that she would reject his help, just as he had once rejected hers. But something inside him told him that he had to help. He quietly knocked on the door. Sarah opened it, and he saw her tear-stained face. "Sarah, what's wrong?" he asked. She shook her head, not wanting to talk. "Please, tell me," Calvin said. "I want to help you, just as you're helping me." And she told him. She told him that her family had died in a fire when she was still a child, that she had grown up in an orphanage, that she had no one left. She told him how hard she had worked to feed herself, and how her dream to find her own home had always remained unfulfilled. She told him about her loneliness, about her longing. Calvin realized that she wasn't just helping him, she was looking for a family. She was looking for her home. He looked at her tear-stained face, and he felt so sorry for her that he forgot about his own pain. He reached out and wiped away her tears. "You have a home now, Sarah," he said. "You're not alone anymore." Sarah looked at him, and there was hope in her eyes, hope that it was true, that she had found her place in this world. From that moment on, their relationship changed. Calvin no longer kept her at a distance. He told her about his life with Lily, about how he had been before her death. He shared his fears and hopes with her, and she listened without interrupting, without judging. One day, when they were sitting by the fireplace, she quietly asked, "Calvin, did you love your wife more than life itself?" he replied, and there was not a hint of doubt in his voice. Sarah nodded. "Was she happy with you?" "Yes," Calvin replied. "She always said that I was her safest place to be." Sarah smiled. "Then you did everything right." That simple phrase was worth more than anything in the world to Calvin. It was the truth. He had done everything he could, and Lily had been happy. And, he thought, perhaps somewhere up there, she was smiling, seeing that her children were in safe hands. Calvin looked at Sarah. In her eyes, he saw not pity, but understanding. In her face, he saw not the shadow of Lily, but her own unique beauty. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that he was ready to move on. He knew that Lily would always live in his heart, but that didn't mean his heart had to be closed to other people. To Sarah, Calvin reached out and took her hand in his. And in that moment, he felt his heart finally begin to heal. He knew that this path would be long, but he was ready to walk it. And, perhaps, he wouldn't walk it alone. With each passing day spent on the Howard Ranch, Sarah became more deeply rooted in their lives. The house, once filled with dead silence and the smell of dust, was coming alive. The walls absorbed new sounds, the clinking of dishes, the twins' joyful laughter, Sarah's voice reading aloud to Andrew. The children adored her. To them, she wasn't a replacement, but simply Sarah, the one who always knew where a lost toy was and who could tell the most captivating stories before bed. They had grown accustomed to her strong, yet gentle hands, to the scent of lavender that always came from her dress, and to her smile that lit up even the grayest day. Calvin's resolve grew stronger. He no longer felt like a broken ghost wandering through his own home. He worked in the field with renewed vigor, knowing that not only the children, but also Sarah, were waiting for him at the house. They became a team. He took care of the men's work, she of the women's. And this balance was a salvation for him. He noticed with surprise how his own attitude towards her was changing. He no longer saw her as just an assistant. He saw her as a woman who had brought light into his life. Their conversations by the fireplace after the children had fallen asleep became the most important part of his day. He opened his soul to her, telling her about his fears, about his love for Lily, about how hard it had been for him to cope alone. He was grateful to Sarah for her patience, for her silent understanding. He felt that his heart, which had been broken, was slowly but surely healing. But one day, this idyll was disrupted. Two men appeared in town. Their names were Daniel and Walter. They were dressed in dusty road coats, had a week's growth of stubble on their faces, and their eyes were cold and piercing. They asked the townspeople about the Howard family. Their questions were persistent, yet strangely vague. They didn't mention the names of the children or Calvin, but just talked about the family with 4 kids on the ranch beyond the hills. One of the neighbors, Mr. McGregor, who often traded with Calvin, told them where the ranch was located. When Daniel and Walter arrived at the Howard ranch, Calvin was in the field. He saw 2 strangers dismount and head towards the house. His heart skipped a beat. In the Wild West, uninvited guests rarely brought anything good. He hurried to the house, his hand on his holster. Sarah came out onto the porch, seeing the strangers. A shadow of fear that Calvin had never seen before flashed in her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. Daniel smirked. "We're looking for someone, miss," he said. "Maybe you know something about the family that lives here." Sarah raised her head. "I don't know what family you're talking about," she replied. "Calvin and I live here with the children." Calvin approached them, his gaze as cold as steel. He knew Sarah was trying to protect them, but he couldn't understand why. "Leave," he said. "There's no one you're looking for here." Daniel and Walter exchanged glances. "And who are you?" Walter asked. "I'm the owner of this ranch," Calvin replied. "And I don't like uninvited guests." Walter laughed. "Uninvited guests? Then what is this woman doing here?" "She's not your wife." Calvin felt anger boiling inside him. He couldn't understand what these people wanted, but their audacity infuriated him. "That's none of your business," he said, placing his hand on the handle of his pistol. "Leave before I change my mind." Daniel and Walter, realizing that Calvin was serious, backed off. "We'll be back," Daniel said before they left. "And you'll regret not wanting to talk to us." When they left, Calvin turned to Sarah. "Who are they?" he asked. Sarah lowered her eyes. She didn't want to answer. "Sarah," he repeated, her name sounding firm. "Who are they?" She took a deep breath. They're from the orphanage where I grew up," she said. "They're looking for me." Calvin was surprised. He had expected anything but this. "But why?" he asked. "What did you do to them?" Sarah shook her head. "Nothing. But they think I know where the orphanage's money is hidden." Calvin didn't understand. "What money?" he asked. Sarah looked around, making sure the children couldn't hear them, and quietly said, "A few years ago, there was a fire at the orphanage. The director said all the savings were burnt. But I know that's not true. He hid them. And I saw where. I just didn't know he was going to die, and that his accomplices would be so desperate to find that money." A look of shock flashed in Calvin's eyes. He couldn't believe that this fragile, yet strong, woman could be involved in such a story. You knew where the money was and didn't tell anyone?" he asked. "I didn't want them to get it," she replied. "They were using the money we had been collecting for years for themselves. I wanted it to go to a good cause." Calvin looked at her frightened, but honest eyes, and he knew she was telling the truth. He understood that her arrival at the ranch hadn't been a coincidence. She wasn't just looking for a home, but a refuge, and she had found it. And now he and his children were in danger. He felt his resolve turn to anger, but this anger was directed not at Sarah, but at these 2 men who had dared to invade his life and threaten his family. He couldn't let that happen. He had to protect her, just as she had protected him. Calvin's anger was like a slowly kindling fire. He no longer felt like a victim of circumstances, a helpless widower who was pitied. He had become a protector, and that feeling gave him strength. He looked at Sarah, at her frightened, yet determined face, and understood that her secret had become his secret, her danger his danger. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice firm, without accusation. "I didn't want to put you in danger," she replied, lowering her head. "You've been through so much already." Calvin took her hands. They were cold. "And I can't let you handle this alone," he said. "This house, these children. You're part of our family now, and we will protect each other." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes full of tears. In them, he saw not only fear, but also the relief that she had been hiding for so long. She was no longer alone in her struggle, and that gave her strength. She told him everything in the smallest detail: how the orphanage director, Old Mr. Hogan had hidden the money collected for repairs, and then died before he could tell anyone. How Daniel and Walter, his former accomplices, had started hunting for her, believing she knew where the money was hidden. They had tortured her at the orphanage, leaving her no choice but to run away. Calvin realized that he couldn't just sit and wait. He had to act. First, he sent the children to town to old Mrs. Evelyn, who was like a grandmother to them. He knew that there they would be safe. "Why are you doing this, Dad?" Andrew asked, hugging him tightly. "I have to protect our home, son," Calvin replied. "I'll be back soon. Be strong, like a real man." After saying goodbye to the children, Calvin returned to the ranch. He and Sarah were alone. The house, which only yesterday had been filled with children's laughter, was now empty. The silence was oppressive, but Calvin was ready for a fight. He knew that Daniel and Walter would return. He prepared himself. He checked all his rifles, loaded his pistols, and set up traps around the perimeter of the ranch. He was ready for battle. Sarah, seeing his preparations, was amazed. She had never seen him like this. This quiet, sad man, who not long ago couldn't even handle the children, had turned into a warrior. He was like a wild wolf protecting his den. "Calvin," she said quietly, "are you sure you want to do this? You can just leave." "And you?" he asked. "Do you think they'll give up on you?" "No. They'll hunt you down to the very end. And I won't let them harm you." Calvin's words were like a balm to her soul. She finally felt safe. She was no longer alone, going through life, clinging to a shadow. She was with a man who was ready to fight for her. And in her heart, which had been full of fear, a small, but strong spark of hope appeared. Hope that everything would be okay. They waited. Day turned into night, night into day. And then, at dawn, when the fog had not yet lifted, they saw two silhouettes approaching the house. "They're here," Calvin whispered. Sarah pressed against him. He hugged her. "Go inside and wait for my signal," he said. Sarah obeyed. She was ready to do whatever he said, because she trusted him. Calvin went out onto the porch. His heart was pounding like crazy, but he was calm. He knew what he was doing. He knew he had to protect his new family. Daniel and Walter approached the house. "We've come to take what belongs to us," Daniel said. "There's nothing here that belongs to you," Calvin replied. "Leave." Daniel sneered. "Don't make us, boy," he said. "We don't want to kill, but we'll stop at nothing to get what's ours." "You won't get anything," Calvin replied. "And now I know what kind of people you are. You prey on the defenseless. But now she has a protector." Daniel pulled out his pistol. Calvin, without losing a second, raised his rifle. He didn't want to shoot, but he was ready. He was ready for anything for her. At that moment, Walter, who was circling the house from the other side, suddenly cried out in pain. He had stepped into one of Calvin's traps. His cry made Daniel look back, and that was all the time Calvin needed. He fired. Daniel fell, clutching his wounded shoulder. His pistol flew to the side. "You'll regret this," he growled. "I already do," Calvin replied. "But I would regret it even more if I hadn't protected her." At that moment, Sarah came out of the house. She stood on the porch, holding a rifle. She wasn't a professional marksman, but she was ready to defend her new home. Daniel and Walter, realizing they were in a losing situation, retreated. They hadn't expected such a resistance. They hadn't expected this quiet, sad man to be so strong. When they disappeared behind the hills, Calvin lowered his rifle. His hands were trembling. He walked over to Sarah and hugged her. I thought I couldn't do it," he whispered. "You did, Calvin," she replied. "You did." They stood, embracing, and there was relief in their hearts. They had survived this ordeal together, and this ordeal brought them even closer. They were no longer just two people living in the same house. They were family. And they were ready to do anything to protect each other. A tense silence fell over the ranch after the clash with Daniel and Walter. The air was still thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Calvin, having made sure the unwelcome guests wouldn't be returning anytime soon, hugged Sarah. Her body was trembling from the shock. He felt her press against him and realized that their bond was now more than just an arrangement. It was something greater, forged by shared danger. Hope was replaced by relief, but that was in turn followed by anxiety. "What now?" "They won't stop, Calvin," Sarah said, pulling away from him. Her eyes, still filled with terror, looked at him. "They'll be back. And next time, they'll be better prepared." Calvin knew she was right. These men were dangerous, they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And he understood that his ranch wasn't a fortress that could be defended indefinitely. They had to act. "We have to find that money," he said firmly. "It's the only way to get rid of them for good." Sarah shook her head. "I don't know where it is. I only saw Mr. Hogan hide it. He went into the cellar and came back with empty hands. I thought it was under the floor or in the wall." Calvin thought for a moment. He was an experienced farmer. He knew what hideouts and caches were. He looked at the cellar, which was under the house. It was old and hadn't been used in a long time. "What else do you remember?" he asked. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to recall the moment. He was holding a box. It was small, wooden, with an eagle carved on it. He was very careful, she faltered, remembering the details. And then, when he came out, he placed a book on the floor. An old, thick book. He said it was the last of our collection. Calvin felt his heart skip a beat. The last of our collection. He knew what she was talking about. It was a phrase used by members of the Masonic Lodge to which his father had belonged. They often hid important things in caches and then left a key item in plain sight, with a special phrase. There was an identical book in his family's library. Intrigue filled his thoughts. Could it be a coincidence, or was Mr. Hogan a member of the lodge? It was the only reasonable explanation for what she had seen. Calvin understood that if his guess was correct, the money wasn't simply hidden in the cellar. It was hidden in a special cache that could only be opened with a specific mechanism. He led Sarah into the library. Among the old, dusty books, he found the very one his father had once left. It was thick, leather-bound, with an eagle emblem on the cover. He took it in his hands, and his heart filled with anticipation. He opened it. There was nothing inside but empty pages. "I don't understand," Sarah said, shaking her head in disappointment. "What does this mean?" "It means I was right," Calvin replied. "This is the key. We need to go back to the cellar." They went down into the cold, dark cellar. Calvin shone his lantern. The walls were stone. The floor was dirt. He began to carefully examine every detail. In the corner, under one of the beams, he saw a small, almost imperceptible crack. He tried to insert a knife into it, but nothing happened. He was holding a box with an eagle on it, Sarah whispered, trying to remember. And the book had an eagle on it too. "Maybe it's related." Calvin took the book in his hands. He ran his finger over the eagle carving. Suddenly, he felt something click under his finger. He pressed harder. The carving came away, and a small, metal key fell out of it. "Here it is," he said, handing it to Sarah. Her eyes were wide with shock. She couldn't believe that the key to her freedom had been so close all this time. They inserted the key into the crack in the wall and turned it. A loud, metallic click echoed in the wall, and a section of the wall moved away, revealing an entrance to a small cache. Inside lay the same wooden box with the eagle. Inside were not only money, but also documents that proved that Mr. Hogan, Daniel, and Walter were part of a gang that robbed banks and trains. This money wasn't the orphanage's savings, but stolen goods, and Mr. Hogan, apparently, didn't want to share it with his accomplices. Sarah looked at Calvin, and there was joy in her eyes. But it wasn't the joy of the money, it was the joy of finally being free. "Now they can't do anything to us," she said. Calvin nodded, but he knew they couldn't just take this money. It was dirty, soaked with the blood of innocent people. "We have to turn it over to the authorities," he said. "It's the only way." Sarah agreed. She understood that this was the only way they could get rid of the shadow of the past. But they both knew that this would be a very dangerous step. Daniel and Walter wouldn't forgive them for it. They closed the cache, but before leaving, Calvin left a note inside. He wrote that the money had been handed over to the authorities and that now they could forget about their dirty business. He hoped that this would stop them, but deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning of a real battle. The hope for a quick resolution to all their problems, which had appeared after finding the cache, was quickly replaced by fear. Calvin and Sarah knew that by turning the money over to the authorities, they would be signing their own death warrant. Daniel and Walter were not just robbers, but cruel and ruthless murderers. They had no conscience, no pity. Their only goal was to get the money, and they would stop at nothing to get it. Calvin couldn't put his children in danger. He understood that the only way to protect them was to leave the ranch. But where could they go? The Wild West was a huge and dangerous place. They had no money to buy new land, and they couldn't stay on the old ranch that he had built with his own hands. He felt despair rising in his throat again. He had tried so hard to get his life back on track, and now it was collapsing before his eyes again. "We can't just leave," Sarah said when they discussed the matter. "They will look for us, and we can't run forever." "What do you suggest?" Calvin asked, his voice full of desperation. "Stay here and wait for them to come for us." Sarah thought for a moment, and then her eyes lit up. "We can use that money," she said. "Not for ourselves, Calvin, but to create a new home for ourselves. In another place, where no one will find us." Calvin shook his head. "We can't. This money, it is dirty. We can't build a new life on someone else's blood." "But if we don't," Sarah replied, "then we won't have a life at all. We have to use this money for a good purpose, to protect the children, to protect ourselves, and maybe then, in the future, we can atone for our guilt by helping others." Calvin looked at her. He knew she was right. It wasn't a choice between good and evil, but a choice between survival and death. They had to use this dirty money to create a clean, honest life. He made his decision. They would leave. The next day, they secretly packed their things, loaded them onto the wagon, and, without saying goodbye to anyone, left the ranch. Calvin knew he had to go back to return the money, but first, he had to get Sarah and the children away. They traveled on the dusty, winding roads of the Wild West, not knowing where they were going. They were scared. They were lonely, but they were together, and that was the most important thing for them. Calvin felt his heart clench with pain when he remembered his old home. His life was broken, but he believed that he could build a new one. After a few days, they reached a small town called Silver Creek. It was small, but very cozy. The residents were kind and welcoming. Calvin found a job at the local sawmill, and Sarah at the bakery. They began a new life, but the past didn't let go of them. One evening, as Calvin and Sarah were having dinner, he saw an article in the newspaper. It had a photo of Daniel and Walter. The article said that they were wanted for bank robbery and murder. They were called dangerous criminals who had left a bloody trail all over the West. Calvin felt his heart skip a beat. They were so close. They could find them at any moment. He looked at Sarah. There was terror in her eyes. She understood that their freedom was just an illusion, that they couldn't hide forever. "We have to go back," he said firmly. "We have to give them that money. And we have to do it now, before they find us." Sarah agreed. She knew it was the only way. They had to put an end to this story once and for all. They had to go back to the ranch. They had to face their past head-on. The next day, they left the children with Mrs. Evelyn and started the journey back. They knew they were walking into certain death, but they were ready. They were ready to sacrifice themselves for freedom. When they arrived at the ranch, their hearts ached with pain. The house was empty. It was the same as they had left it, but they felt that something had changed. The air was heavy, tense. They knew they weren't alone. "They're here," Sarah whispered. At that moment, Daniel and Walter came out from behind the corner of the house. They were waiting for them. They knew they would return. Well, Daniel sneered. "You finally came, Bo. We thought you decided to run away like a coward." "I didn't run away," Calvin replied. "I came to put an end to this." "You can't put an end to it," Walter said, "until you give us what's ours." Calvin pulled a bag full of money from inside his coat. "Here," he said, "take it, and get out of here." Daniel sneered. "You think it's that simple?" he said. "You think we'll just leave?" "No, we'll take not only the money, we'll take your life." At that moment, Calvin felt his heart fill with anger. He was ready for this. He was ready to fight. He was ready to die, but he couldn't let them harm Sarah. "You won't get anything," he growled, "because I'm ready to die, but I won't let you harm her." The air on the ranch was thick with tension. Daniel and Walter stood a few feet away from Calvin and Sarah, their faces distorted with malice. Behind him, Calvin felt Sarah, her trembling body, and it gave him strength. He knew he had to protect her at all costs. "You think we'll stop?" Walter growled. "You think we'll let you live while we rot in prison?" "I'm not going to give up," Calvin replied, "and I won't let you harm her." At that moment, Daniel pulled out a pistol, but he didn't have time to shoot. Calvin, using the distraction, lunged at him. He hit him in the face, and Daniel fell, dropping his pistol. Walter, taken aback by this turn of events, rushed at Calvin, but Sarah, without losing a second, picked up the pistol from the ground and aimed it at Walter. "Don't move," she shouted. Her voice trembled, but it was filled with determination. Walter froze. He hadn't expected this fragile woman to be so brave. At that moment, Daniel, who was wounded, tried to get up, but Calvin, without losing a second, kicked him in the face, and Daniel fell again. "You lost," Calvin said. But at that moment, a shot rang out. The bullet flew past Calvin's head, hitting the wall of the house. They looked around. It was Daniel. He had pulled another pistol from inside his coat and fired. At that moment, Sarah, without a moment's hesitation, shielded Calvin with her body. He felt a strong shove in his chest, and then she fell to the ground, clutching her stomach. "Sarah!" Calvin screamed. He grabbed Daniel's pistol and fired. The bullet hit him right in the heart. Daniel fell, without making a sound. Calvin rushed to Sarah. She was lying on the ground, her eyes closed. He picked her up in his arms and held her close. "No. No," Keith whispered. "You can't die." But she was still alive. She opened her eyes and smiled. I'm happy, Calvin," she whispered. "I found my home." Her voice grew quieter. Calvin knew he had to act fast. He picked her up in his arms and ran into the house. He laid her on the bed and started looking for medicine. But he knew it wouldn't help. She needed a doctor, but there wasn't one close by. "I won't leave you," he said. "I'll be with you. I won't leave you." Sarah shook her head. "You have to live, Calvin," she whispered. "You have to live for them." "I love you," Calvin said. The words just came out. He hadn't thought he would say them, but he had to. He had to tell her how he felt. I love you too," she replied, and her eyes closed. Calvin felt his heart shatter into pieces. He had lost her. He had lost the woman who had brought him back to life. He was alone. Again, despair and pain overwhelmed him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He held her in his arms, and he felt life leave her body. He was ready to give up. He was ready to die. He was ready to let go of his life. But at that moment, he heard voices. It was the voices of his children. They were running towards the house, screaming, "Dad, Dad!" And at that moment, Calvin realized that he couldn't die. He couldn't give up. He couldn't leave his children. He had to live for them. He looked at Sarah. He knew she wouldn't want him to give up. She wanted him to be happy. She wanted him to live. He took her hand and kissed it. "I'll live, Sarah," he said. "I'll live for you, for the children. I'll live." He kept his word. He buried Sarah next to Lily, under the big oak tree. He planted the flowers she loved so much on her grave, and he came to her every day, telling her how he was doing, how the children were growing up. He told her that he had bought a new cow, that he had built a new barn, that he had taught Andrew how to shoot a rifle. He told her about everything, and in his heart, although it was full of sorrow, there was also hope. Hope that everything would be all right. Conclusion: the story of Calvin and Sarah is a tale of love, loss, healing, and the power of the human spirit. It begins with Calvin's deep despair, having lost his wife and his will to live. His world was destroyed, and he saw no future. But the appearance of Sarah, a girl with her own tragic fate, became the catalyst for his revival. Their relationship, which began as an arrangement for help, turned into a strong bond based on mutual trust and respect. Together, they overcame many difficulties, including an attack by bandits from Sarah's past. And these trials only made them stronger. The final battle at the ranch is the climax of the story. Calvin, who had recently been broken by grief, turned into a brave protector. He was ready to sacrifice himself for Sarah, and she, in turn, shielded him with her body, saving his life. It was an act of the highest love and self-sacrifice. Despite the tragic outcome, the story ends on a note of hope. Calvin, having lost Sarah, did not break. He understood that he had to live, for his children and for the love he had found. He became a strong and wise man who had not only found a new family, but also a new understanding of life. The story teaches us that even in the darkest of times, there is a place for light, and that true strength lies not in never falling, but in finding the strength to get up every time.